I'm just really excited to introduce two people who have experience that goes beyond the confines of the topic this morning. So I welcome you to sound them out as you like, especially again if you want to reach out outside of the program. They are Charles Heller and Itamar Mann. Charles is with Forensic Oceanography, a really exciting project in line with some very cutting edge work going on in international law and cognate fields, or maybe even not cognate, other fields. Itamar Mann from the University of Haifa doing absolutely wonderful work, also affiliated with the GLAN network. We heard from Jonas and Garode last night. Without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. And first, thank you so much for inviting us to this very exciting special program. I think the format that we have this year, although it has many limitations, also provides opportunities. And I know that some of you are really spread out around the world, and to have everyone together in this way, I think is quite special. And I want to open up this session just by saying a few words about the work that Charles Heller and I have been doing together for now several years, I think since around 2013 or 2014, when we started to work together. And this work is really a constant dialogue between legal thinking and legal practice, and a certain kind of spatial analysis that relies a lot on surveillance technologies, on testimony from activists, asylum seekers, migrants on the ground, and brings these two bodies of knowledge together in a way that I think was really remarkable and really formed at least the way I think about law and about litigation in particular. Charles agreed to participate after I kind of suggested that he joins us. And for me personally, this is an enormous opportunity, because it's also an opportunity for us to reflect together on work that really is now spanning a number of projects about which we want to tell you and which we want to share with you as models for certain kinds of action, maybe certain kinds of mistakes we'll see as we progress. And I don't want to say a lot more at this stage. I will hand it over to Charles very soon, but I do want to flag a few other themes that I think will come up in our 3-hour session this morning. So I said something about the kind of co-production or co-constitution of law and spatial analysis, which I think is a main issue that we want to discuss with you, with particular emphasis on a certain kind of space, the maritime space, which is in many ways very different from the kind of traditional space of politics, urban space, or indeed a notion of territory as we know it from international law. The sea, as you know, has certain legal characteristics that make it very special. I think most importantly, the duty of rescue under Article 98 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, as well as the old and enduring doctrine of the freedom of navigation, which creates a very different environment for mobility. And in this context, we have been working on what I think of as a project that is mainly about border violence and border justice as two liminal notions that are oftentimes problematic for a kind of liberal legalism. And we have really sustained our work on those particular contexts. And in the recent years, our work has been formed largely by two major events and processes historically. One is the uprisings in the Mediterranean area, in the North African countries, as well as in the Middle East, that really unleashed new forms of asylum seeking and migration through the Mediterranean as a kind of border space between Europe and the Middle East and Africa. That has really informed our work, and we want to talk about that. And the second process, which we have seen in the last years and we want to also reflect about, is the way in which migration has arisen as a major issue around what people are thinking about as a backlash against courts. So what made migration so important for human rights courts over the years, and what has made it so politically divisive, and how does that inform work in the context of international legal practice and litigation in particular? So those are, I think, a number of the major themes that we want to think about, not all inclusive, and we really invite your participation and look forward to your thoughts and questions. But for now, I think that works as a beginning, and I hand it over to Charles for a number of introductory words as well.
Thanks a lot, Itamar. Let me also join Itamar in thanking Jeff, the whole team, for putting this together. And I'm also really delighted to think and be in dialogue with all of you today. Let me, also express my appreciation of the collaboration with Itamar over the last years. Itamar is a friend, but also really one of the brightest and sharpest legal minds that I know. And two things I think I particularly appreciate in Itamar's thinking. The first would be his ever readiness to push the boundaries of the law and, as we will see, of jurisdiction, of the thinking of jurisdiction, how we can establish jurisdiction when precisely states seek to evade jurisdiction. So this is also an issue that we're going to discuss with you later. And the second is that even though Itamar, with other fellow GLAN members, is always ready to embark on new investigative legal litigation adventures, right? So he is very much geared towards practice. He's also always questioning legal practice. And this for me would be an attitude that I would really characterize as shaping a kind of critical legal practice, just as we can think of a critical humanitarian practice embodied by organizations such as MSF, which is both geared at intervening, right, through the tools of the law, but also always ready to question the limits, the ambivalences of legal practice. And so this is really a form of critical legal practice in which thinking and doing are really in a dialectical process, which is really extremely important and rich for me. So again, we're very, very happy to be doing this seminar together and thinking with all of you. This is a privileged moment for us. So while we'll be really going into quite a bit of detail into investigations, into violations, changing policies, and the associated legal questions with you this morning, we did think it would be important to introduce you a bit to the overall context of the Mediterranean frontier as we see it. And so this is what we'll do very briefly before going into more specific investigations. Let me just share my screen here to show a few slides. Okay. You can see my slides okay, right? Okay. So, excuse me, okay. So migrants' deaths along the Mediterranean frontier are a long-standing and structural outcome of what one might call a mobility conflict a conflict of which the Mediterranean is a major fault line, but of course, not at all the only zone across the world, right? Mobility conflicts predominantly arise from the opposition between the desires and movements of citizens of the global south who seek to reach areas of greater affluence for protection, for looking for jobs, looking for a better life, and the restrictive policies of states of the global north and the bordering practices that they implement as a result. Mobility conflicts, and particularly the mobility conflict around Europe, are not really bound to any specific space, right? They're a relational conflict, right? But they do crystallize very starkly around particular border zones, including the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean today is a fault line of the world system. It marks the southern external borders of the political community of the EU, but it is also marked by high levels of economic inequality, as well as racialization of the populations of its different shores. So even as we focus on specific policies, I think it's quite essential not to lose sight of the political significance of this Mediterranean frontier. And we need to ask, how and when did the Mediterranean become such a contentious limit? Why are the migrants who transgress it excluded from European space in the first place? Now, usually scholars, activists have a kind of shorthand narrative, if you will, to answer those questions. A narrative that usually is traced to the beginning of the 90s. The narrative, in a few words, goes roughly like this, right? At the turn of the 90s, the EU consolidated an area of freedom of movement for European citizens. And that expansion of freedom of movement within the EU for European citizens was predicated on the simultaneous hardening of the external borders of the EU and denial of freedom of movement to citizens of the global south. And as a result, those who refused their spatial assignation, right, were forced to resort to clandestine and precarious means of crossing borders, right? So if illegalized migration, I use the term illegalized to underline that illegality is really the product of state legislation, a process rather than an inherent condition. If illegalized migration is clearly, it's co-substantial to any migration regime. Any migration regime which puts limits to the movement of people also generates forms of evasion, right? So we see forms of illegalized migration emerge at different moments of history. But it really becomes a large-scale and structural process of the European migration around the turn of the 90s. And it also leads to the precaritization of migrants' journeys and the structural death of migrants at EU borders. United Against Racism, an NGO, has just released its latest list of deaths, which records more than 40,000 documented deaths at the borders of Europe, predominantly at the EU's maritime frontier. And of course, many more deaths, migrant deaths, have occurred without leaving any other trace than the haunting absence that disappeared and dead migrants leave for their families. Now, while there is no doubt that the 90s and the consolidation of the EU and freedom of movement within the EU is a major turning point, I do find at times that this is a too limited historicization, right? And that the uneven and exclusionary mobility regime that we see at work in the present needs to be traced to a longer time frame, if you will. And in fact, very, very simply, to the expansion of European empires across the southern shores of the Mediterranean. Of course, we don't have time here to go into any depth into that history, but I really think that and you know, the historians such as Julia Clancy-Smith, whose book Mediterraneans is really a fabulous place to start for anyone who is interested in these issues. Historians really show that the expansion of European empires from the beginning of the 19th century to the early 20th really marked a profound break in Mediterranean politics and the politics of mobility in particular, with European immigrants initially crossing in great number as part of that imperial expansion. But the movements of the colonized, which was much more limited, controlled, as you can see with this identity document for an Algerian, I'm at pains to find the right term because these were imperial citizens, right? This was not an Algerian national in the sense that we would understand today, since Algeria was part of the empire state that France was at the time, right? And in fact, when immediately after the First World War, when colonized populations were for the first time recruited on a very large scale to fight European wars and work in European factories, immediately after the First World War, much stricter restrictions are once again put onto the movement of colonized populations. And actually, the earliest cases of death while seeking to cross the Mediterranean that are a result of restrictive migration policies can really be traced to that moment. Here you see the Sidi Farouche incidents in which 20 Moroccans were found dead in the hold of a ferry connecting Algeria to the port of Marseille. So even extremely briefly, I thought it was important to convey a little bit this context of a mobility conflict, the way this conflict has arisen within a relatively short-term history connected to the expansion of freedom of movement within the EU, but also a more longue durée history related to the history of empire. And I think that locating the Mediterranean mobility conflict within that more longue durée history allows us to understand that questions of race, of class, which maybe do not appear so clearly within the Europeanization narrative, are in fact really subterranean currents that are agitating, if you will, the Mediterranean waters and profoundly shape the mobility conflict that we see at work today. Now, illegalized migrants crossing the sea at present embark on a journey across a complex legal space, crisscrossed by multiple overlapping jurisdictions, which you see quite faintly indicated on this map. You have, I'm sure you're familiar with this, territorial waters, contiguous zones, exclusive economic zones, and maybe very faintly in red, you see here indicated the search and rescue areas within which states are responsible to coordinate rescue activities. And so this is a very particular legal space that is, as Itamar was mentioning earlier, is quite different from the way rights and responsibility operates on firm land. And to try and think of this space, we've been very much inspired by the work of Saskia Sassen and the concept of unbundled sovereignty that she's forged in the past, right? And this is very simply somehow the idea that if rights and responsibilities are neatly stacked one on top of the other on firm land, at sea you have kind of an unbundling, an unstacking, if you will, of those rights and obligations, and their application to different spatial extents, depending on those very specific domains of rights and responsibilities. But of course, I'll leave you, Itamar, to continue on unpacking the legal politics of the maritime frontier.
Okay, excellent. This was really fascinating for me. I will say a few words about the trajectory of mobility conflicts as understood in a legal context, in an international legal context, and then I will want us to dive into particular investigations that we had, as we have discussed previously. But I think really it's important, and here I'm going to say a few quite basic things, I believe, but still we should put them on the table, to realize that at the heart of the history that Charles just described to you, there is a kind of discord or a disagreement between different legal understandings of cross-border mobility and the rights and duties that they create for states, or the privileges that they create for states to indeed close their borders. So I think that within the slightly longer story that Charles tells, there are two different important categories that come up. One explicitly, namely the history of colonization and the way that movement was limited in the decolonization process in order to insulate Europe from its former colonies. And the other is the history of persecution within Europe itself, which also really casts the backdrop for the legal understanding of what it means to seek asylum. So as you may know, when we talk about migration, we oftentimes first focus in a legal context on refugees when we talk about migration, forced displacement, because refugees do have relatively firm legal rights under the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, where people who have fled after being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or a political opinion, and have a well-founded fear if they're sent back to their country, are internationally protected. And this regime began in Europe in the post-World War II moment, and it initially included only Europe and was organized around the imagination of Nazi and then Soviet persecution. As we move forward through decolonization, this regime becomes global with the 1967 protocol, essentially, but also the people moving due to duress, due to needs that are fundamental so that they have no other option but leaving their countries, their characteristics change. And in many cases, we see much more migration due to dire poverty and recently climate change. And in these contexts, there are no such hard duties for states to avoid refoulement, avoid returning the duty to avoid refoulement is, of course, across the board, but it is understood in a narrow way, which excludes people that are moving due to these newer challenges. And for us, in our work in the Mediterranean context, this was constantly an issue because on the one hand, we have a kind of expansive idea of protections for humans crossing borders as such, and we are, connected to the open borders movement in some ways, or the, these kinds of more radical visions of freedom of mobility, which do not have a solid legal framework that they can rely on. And on the other hand, the protection for refugees, which has this kind of a World War II core that still is very, very operative and seems discordant with many cases that come up right now. And from here, what results is a need to rely on other sources of law. And the sources of law that we have engaged in this context, obviously, most obviously, of course, are human rights law and the right to life. And we will talk about whether the right to life protects people from drowning in the Mediterranean Sea en masse, as they have been over the last few years. And it's the problem of jurisdiction here is central. But also we have come to rely a lot on the law of the sea, as myself as well as Charles have already alluded to, and trying to think about the duty to rescue in ways that provide and foster and generate a stronger aspect to the right to life, which may otherwise be limited in the context that we are discussing. And we also have engaged with criminal law in various moments, and particularly international criminal law, to think about whether, for example, the omission of a duty to rescue constitutes a criminal offense, and whether it can constitute an international criminal offense when it happens in a widespread and systematic way. And lastly, I want to mention also an aspect of human rights law that doesn't apply to the migrants and refugees themselves, but rather starts from the political rights of participation of those volunteers who come to assist and who come to act in a humanitarian way at sea. Sometimes it seems that states are really cracking down on them with unprecedented criminalization projects across the Mediterranean area. And here the response is to protect their political rights of participation, freedom of association, and freedom of expression as a way to also kind of bypass problems of jurisdiction that relate to the migrants and asylum seekers themselves, and protect them kind of by the way or vicariously. The last word I want to say as a general legal kind of background has to do with Charles's emphasis in the beginning of his words on the kind of comparative contexts. So with the global map that Charles showed, you saw, among other places, the kind of Caribbean space between Central, Latin, and North America. And you saw the maritime areas surrounding Australia. And a lot of our work has also been informed by a kind of close engagement and learning process with regard to the legal strategies that states take in order to close these maritime routes around the world. And we have observed a really fascinating learning process and constant distribution of legal doctrine around these three major frontiers of the mobility conflict that Charles describes. And if states learn from one another, we started to think we too should be learning from these comparative contexts how to extraterritorialize not border enforcement, but human rights protections, and how to anticipate the movement of legal doctrine from one context to the other in order to kind of prevent or preempt dangerous developments that are foreseeable when one looks on this kind of transnational terrain together. So that was also another aspect of our work that we have constantly engaged in, and recently has also become very prevalent in the COVID-19 emergencies in the Eastern Mediterranean area that rely to some extent on Australian precedent. So that is something that is also very much underway as we speak. Okay, Charles, why don't we go into one of the investigations?
Let's do that. Oh. Yes, so in this first part this morning, there are, if we make it, two investigations that we'd like to share with you. Very, very briefly, we'll be going through them. And the first concerns what is known as the left-to-die boat case. So forensic oceanography began in the wake of the Arab uprisings, right? And I think we need to understand what was happening there and how this was influencing the Mediterranean border regime, right? In a sense, what you can see is that with the toppling of authoritarian regimes, what also came crashing down, if you will, were the pillars of the EU's policies of border control externalization, right? So regimes such as Tunisia, such as Libya, and others had been tasked with outsourced border control of their own citizens, but also of any citizen that sought to transit through their countries in seeking to reach EU territories. So when the Ben Ali regime and the Gaddafi regime, and then the Egyptian regime as well, vacillated, it is also the European migration regime that was profoundly destabilized as with the vacuum left by these authoritarian states and their security apparatuses, migrants were able to reopen the Mediterranean frontier, which had been practically sealed off through these policies of externalized border control. So just after the toppling of the Ben Ali regime in January 2011, several thousand Tunisians seized the freedom to move that their state, in collaboration with the EU, had denied them. After the popular uprising is quickly suppressed in Libya, leading to the emergence of a civil war, which is only heightened by the international intervention of the NATO-led coalition. A greater number of migrant workers, often, there were several 100,000 migrant workers living, working in Libya since years, begin to flee to neighboring countries, and parts of them as well across the Mediterranean. So migrants begin crossing once again the sea, but with the regimes that the EU had been relying upon destabilized or simply having been dismantled, having been toppled, the EU can no longer have recourse to its usual practices of interception and pushing migrants back to the southern shores of the Mediterranean. And so what we see is a return of the practices of non-assistance, which had been structural as well since many years, as EU states are reluctant to operate rescue, since rescue entails disembarkation, and disembarkation, in function of the EU's Dublin regulation, entails being responsible for the processing of asylum requests. And this Dublin regime is inherently unequal and puts a greater burden on coastal states such as Spain, Italy, or Greece. And as a result, EU states have long been reluctant to operate rescue, but have also criminalized rescue activities by non-state actors such as fishermen and other private actors, and often engaged in lengthy standoffs as to the disembarkation of rescued migrants by non-state actors, all of which constitutes really a deterrent, if you will, for state and non-state actors to comply with their obligations to rescue any passenger found in distress at sea. So as migrants are reopening, either in exercising their freedom or simply fleeing violence in Libya, as they are reopening the Mediterranean frontier, we see this attitude of principled reluctance, if you will, to operate rescue reemerge with force. And this in particular in the context when, as of March 2011, NATO and associated forces have deployed their operations off the Libyan coast. And as you see from this slide, on the 24th of March 2011, there is a total of 38 warships deployed in the coalition, initially in the stated aim of protecting civilian populations in Libya, which quickly emerged as an operation against the Gaddafi regime. And so as a growing number of migrants' deaths were being recorded at the time, a small but quite strong human rights organization in France, the GISTI, announced in June 2011 that it would file a complaint against NATO, the EU, and all states taking part in the coalition for failing in their obligation to rescue. The GISTI's fundamental argument was that because of the unprecedented level of surveillance deployed by states across the central Mediterranean, these states and these actors at sea could not be aware of the distress of migrants crossing this area. And in failing to bring themselves to avert their situations of distress and death, they were failing in their obligation. The truth is, and this is maybe an interesting anecdote for all of you here, the GISTI had absolutely no idea of how it was going to file that complaint against this wide range of actors. But to a certain extent, that press release, that statement, generated its own reality, if you will, as we, within forensic architecture, initiated the Forensic Oceanography project to try and support that demand for accountability. I'm going to be extremely brief here in discussing the Left to Die boat case that emerged out of this, but you can find it on the Forensic Oceanography report. But essentially, there was only a single photograph of the entire events in which 72 people were abandoned to drift for 14 days in NATO's maritime surveillance area, despite repeated contact, or as Itamar might say, encounter with multiple state and non-state actors. This photograph was taken at the very beginning of the passenger's trajectory by a French surveillance aircraft deployed as part of the NATO operations. And this photograph was sent along with the coordinates of the boat to the Italian Coast Guard. So with only one element that might allow to corroborate the testimonies of the only 9 survivors, right? Only 9 people survived the deadly drift from the 72 initial passengers. We sought to gather additional elements of evidence to corroborate those events. These included distress signals, which contain georeferenced data. We called upon an oceanographer to model the boat's drift during its 14 days. And now that we knew that all vessels in the area had been informed via distress signal of the passenger's distress, and now that we knew the trajectory of the drifting boat, the question became, well, where were those 38 warships, which, as you saw from the slide earlier on, we knew were deployed at sea at the time. So we had recourse to satellite imagery to locate those large vessels deployed at sea. Here, this is a satellite image of 75-meter resolution. So only large vessels are registered in that image, even though the resolution is too low to be able to actually identify the identity and nationality of each one of those vessels. It is very clear that many of those were military. And so through all of these different elements, we were able to map as precisely as possible the chain of events and the trajectory of this boat and its different moments of encounter with different actors, which you see indicated here on this map. And so our 100-page or so report was the basis for a number of legal cases in front of different national courts, initially in Italy, independently of our reports, then France, then Spain, then Belgium. And at present, in fact, most of these processes have been stalled, blocked, and to my knowledge, only the Italian legal process is still ongoing. One of the ideas of the legal team was to exhaust the means of national remedy and ultimately file the complaints in front of the European Courts of Human Rights. We will see if this process eventually goes in that direction. But I leave it to you, Itamar, to unpack maybe further for the participants the legal implications of this particular form of violence through abandonment that we reconstructed in detail in our reports.
Yes. So I'm going to be quick because I want us to reach yet another report in this first session that we have. But I do want to make a number of comments on this initial action that founded Forensic Oceanography. At the time, I was not your legal partner, as I became later. And I remember well when the report was published, I was working on an academic project that later became my book, in which I developed an idea about extraterritorial human rights obligations. And that idea revolved around this notion of the human rights encounter with which Charles just mentioned and talked about quickly. In this particular context, what was interesting and really grabbed my attention was the way that you participated in a kind of reinvention of the duty of rescue under Article 98 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea and the SAR obligations that are under the SAR Convention. These obligations, generally speaking, have a customary international law history. and they require states to make sure that their flag states, including private vessels, perform the duty of rescue when other ships are in distress. And I think the standard knowledge and thinking around this, the history of this duty, imagines large commercial empires that have ships floating around the world in faraway areas, and they have a kind of reciprocal obligation to help each other because, well, you're a Dutch merchant ship in off the Indonesian coast, and I'm a British ship, and if I help you, you will help me in the next time around. So we're kind of in a mutual reciprocal obligation among large empires that have a global reach. And your reconfiguration or reinvention of the duty of rescue, which became enormously influential in my view with the years to come, was to say something else. This is not about a reciprocal obligation that stems from a kind of mutuality of governments, but this is also a duty that can be used in order to save lives of people that have no other state or safety net to fall back on. And in doing that, it was really important not only to invoke the duty as a legal matter, but also to construct it. And this is why in the chapter of my book, which I dedicate to this report, I think mainly about the construction of the human rights encounter. The human rights encounter, as I think of it, is a moment in which a person without any state protection goes out to the high seas and asks for a duty of rescue, is rescued, and then falls under the jurisdiction of a state that has the ability to protect their human rights far beyond the simple protection of life itself, ultimately leading to the possibility of a new membership, the opening of a social contract, and the possibility of a new membership. But the duty of the Left to Die report really illuminates that this is not a matter of happenstance. It's not that one simply meets this authority and says, hey, I'm here, please rescue me, as someone reading the ethical work that I rely mainly on, the work of Emmanuel Levinas, might understand. No, it's also a political project in which technology is employed by migrants in order to generate that duty. If they use a phone, for example, which is the most simple technology, or the boat itself might be thought of as a technology that allows to invoke this kind of duty. And on the other hand, technology is used by states, as you show very well, in order to avoid that moment of encounter, in order to create a kind of veil that will disallow access from boats that require precisely such remedies. This, I think, is, as a matter of kind of legal theory that later informed a lot of legal practice, is the groundbreaking and really inventive aspect of this Left to Die report that really, I think, does become for me a kind of revelation moment.
Thanks, Itamar. I'm seeing that we've been a little bit longer than we hoped in introducing the Left to Die boat report. So I maybe want to be extremely brief in just mentioning another twist in terms of the practices of abandonment, which is that after this report, and actually several years, during several years, we really sought to monitor practices of non-assistance in which vessels in vicinity to a boat in distress fail in their obligation. There was kind of another twist that a subsequent report addressed, and maybe we can discuss it together in more detail later, which is that with the initial deployment, but then the termination of the Italian Mare Nostrum operation, which was decried by EU states as constituting a pull factor, what we have in fact is at work is a veritable policy of non-assistance in which through a shift in state operation, the aim was essentially that no European asset would ever come to be in vicinity to one of those boats in distress, right? By moving the European assets further away from the Libyan coast, the aim is that they're never close to the areas where migrants encounter situations of distress, and so that they cannot be called upon to operate rescue. And with this policy of non-assistance, which aimed to act as a deterrent onto migrants who were crossing the sea, this policy really left a lethal rescue gap that led, in fact, as we show in our death by rescue report, to a staggering increase in the number of deaths at sea and the mortality rate. In particular, I'm sure many of you will recall the 12th and 18th of April 2015, shipwrecks, which in barely a week led to 1,200 deaths at sea. You know, a figure that's really reminiscent or echoes figures from a war zones, as Doctors Without Borders argued at the time. Now, the issue here was that this is an even more distended form of violence that operates much more through inaction at a distance than through lethal action, right? And so while I was working on this report, I contacted Itamar again and asked him, well, Itamar, look, this is a shift in the modalities of violence that we're observing at the maritime frontier. Do you think you can translate this shifting form of violence into a violation? And I think that proved a challenging question, Itamar, to which there was no, let's say, straightforward answer. I don't know, maybe you want to respond or think about this very briefly, or maybe we can continue that question as well in the discussion with the participants.
If I'm allowed just 2 or 3 minutes to respond to that, and then we can open to questions and answers and continue the conversation. So just very briefly, as Charles says, I want to kind of repeat what I understand to be the main narrative of the Death by Rescue report, and then articulate what I think is the main legal challenge here, one that was also very significant, I think, for me. So first, one must understand that the Mare Nostrum operation, by which Italy and the European Union kind of initiated rescue in a relatively large part of the Mediterranean area, beyond Italy's search and rescue area, created a kind of pattern by which people were rescued to some extent. There were also many victims during this period, and it was far from being a full-on kind of rescue operation or full-on invitation to access Europe. But when it was stopped, and Operation Triton, that at the time, as it was called, replaced it, and it was initiated mainly by it was initiated by Frontex, this generated a spike, and the 1,200 deaths that Charles just described are precisely the result of that spike, because you kind of provide some form of rescue and some form of remedy for a period of time, and then you immediately shut it down. And instead of state vessels, private vessels are kind of pushed to fill that gap in rescue responsibilities. What happens is that people die during these rescue operations as a matter of course and as a structural matter, as Charles describes, okay? So these are private vessels that kind of replace the Mare Nostrum operation alongside a very limited Frontex operation that only has a border enforcement mandate and not a rescue mandate. Okay, so the question was whether this kind of omission of rescue obligations constitutes either a human rights violation or a crime where we brought, Charles and Lorenzo Pisani, who also needs to be acknowledged here very, very centrally, brought very ample and very convincing evidence that this was entirely foreseeable. This was entirely foreseeable, the deaths that ensued. It was not a surprise for everyone, and Frontex officials had warned people in Brussels that this is going to occur. And it was very hard, nevertheless, to find an anchor, a legal anchor to sue and to engage. With human rights law, and I'm going to say this very quickly, we had a jurisdictional problem that really dogged our project. And then we started to think about international criminal law as a kind of crime of omission that caused widespread and systematic death. And it was also, I think, had a really strict doctrinal problems to pursue that path. And that led me to write what began as an EJIL blog post and then became an article about the maritime legal black hole, about the way that spaces are constructed in the Mediterranean where people kind of die systematically, but there is no corresponding duty bearer that can be appealed to in order to remedy and generate a framing in which those deaths are violations of a right to life. And so that became, in the kind of pendulum between the activist mode and the critical mode, that became a very bleak moment in the critical mode, where it seemed like there is a kind of hard legal limit that we're hitting, and that we basically cannot go forward in a way that would be also legally and doctrinally convincing for us. And we had many conversations surrounding this. We talked about it time and time again, and I think it was really the height of the hitting law as a kind of wall that disallows access to a substantive notion of justice for people who need to cross borders because they don't have any other option. That's all that I'm going to say at this stage about death by rescue. And I really would like to hear you guys now and kind of have you share some of your thoughts if that's possible. Thank you.
Wonderful. Charles, if you take us out of the screen share, I can see
Yes.
some more of the faces as we go over to questions. So I'm going to look and keep my eye on the blue hands. I'll give you all a moment to sort of think that through and work up some questions. And I'll just do a sort of 30, 40 second, well, almost certainly longer that tie-in with some of the stuff we've been talking about, just very broadly. And I do also have my own questions, but I will hold those. Very broadly, starting with some elements that Charles put out there early on. The problems of legal tools in this area, the ambivalence, that's a word that's come up a number of times at this point. Their enrollment, I don't think these were exactly Charles' words, but their enrollment in programs that make the use of these legal tools very problematic. These are issues that we've started encountering more and more often. And that, as Charles pointed out, pushes up against the limits of what we can do with these things. And here he was speaking to, and then Itamar picked up on what these limits mean. In hitting those limits, the partnership between Itamar and Charles reflects an initiative to bring in other tools. Charles mentioned forensic architecture, which becomes forensic oceanography. Those titles already indicate we're using principles and methods from architecture as well as oceanography to supplement or replace the legal practice, but not totally to displace it, right? So this is a partnership. What happens in this space, a phrase that I was using yesterday, which is Itamar and Charles are talking about the construction of spaces. I was talking about circuits of power. They're both very material images. Yeah. You see this built here with phones, with boats, with satellites. You see mapping exercises. But I do want to emphasize that this isn't just a question of gathering traces, right? We're actually reassembling networks that are competing. That was expressed at one point in this. So when Itamar talks about legal black holes that are creating spaces, yeah, we're also seeing creative efforts to reconfigure those spaces, to undo those spaces, to create different spaces. Yeah? And that's a really important element that's tying together now different parts and different practices. It's not distinct from the legal practice. There's still the jurisdictional exercise. There's still the need to know how law is working in these circuits or these spaces. Yeah. But the law is no longer working alone, which is one of the significant elements of these different initiatives. Okay, I've done that for long enough. I see 2 questions waiting, and I encourage more to come, because if they don't, then I just get to go wild with my own. Okay, the 2 that I have here, Janina and then Chris.
Hello, thank you very much for this very inspiring and informative presentation. I have 2 questions. You cited a statistic that there were 40,000 deaths, and within which time period did they occur? And the second thought is that I totally share your opinion that the Dublin system is not fair and disadvantages states located at the coast. Do you see some developments concerning change? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Janina. Okay, Chris.
I hope it's working.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. My question, I have actually 2 questions. First of all, thank you very much for already this very informative talk that you've had. I'm looking forward to hearing the second part on refoulement. I was wondering, there are a lot of PhD candidates that I know currently that are working on dissertations on this jurisdiction and extraterritorial processing. I think it's one of the most active debates right now in migration and human rights law. How can these people who are going to publish their dissertation probably quite soon, how can they engage also in this discussion? Because I think it's such a waste of all this research that's being done, all these findings that are being done, and then they're just put on this pile and nobody looks at them again. So that's my first question. And then my second question is, I think in asylum law, there's also this problem of public opinion that you always have to deal with, and that kind of negative public opinion that you're struggling with. And I think a few years after this Lampedusa incident, this documentary came out of Fuoco a Mare, Fire at Sea, which I think was very, at least in my surroundings, kind of stirred things up. How do you see kind of this role for also, next to your forensic oceanography, this work of media and these media outlets? Because I think that's also an important thing to engage with in some way. So I was wondering your ideas about this. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a few more hands showing up. Rather than taking 5 at once, shall we take 1 more now and cap it with 3 and then restart with Alessandro and Reg? Itai, would you like to ask the last question for this round?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Charles and Itamar. This is absolutely fascinating. So I apologize for the next question. It's going to be very IHL lawyer type question, but just to pick up on one point I think Itamar made on the fact that, or maybe Charles, you made that point, the majority of vessels in the proximity of that boat were military vessels. To what extent have you looked at military manuals of the flag states? Is that in any way useful to inform the review of their conduct? Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks. We'll get started with the next round with Alessandro and Reg, but we'll turn it over to you two, Charles and Itamar, now.
Itamar, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I can start, no problem. But I think the first question was about a statistic you brought, and I'll leave it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then from the same person, I think it was Janina, there was a question about Dublin, which I frankly did not fully understand. Could you just briefly re-articulate that?
I'm sorry, because according to the Dublin system, the state is responsible who has the first contact with a refugee. And obviously this is not fair. For example, I come from Switzerland. We really don't have so many problems like Italy. And you see some political developments to change that, and why not if there are no developments towards this solution?
Okay, I'll speak now for myself mainly, and I'm not sure whether Charles will subscribe to everything I say or not, but we are very cognizant of this system that is, we believe, is extraordinarily unfair, as you yourself described, and is part of a kind of commodification of human bodies, where through financial, monetary, or other development, forms of development, the cabining of persons is being sold on a global market of services. So this is seen more easily when you look outside European member states at the way that since around 2005, African states have been harnessed to cabin people outside of the European Union with all kinds of explicit or implicit arrangements, legal arrangements that provided development aid in return for this service. And in my view, also within the European Union, it's not so different. So certain countries at the external borders of the European Union are get these imposed duties in return for a perceived compensation, or in return for some form of access to the European market. And so that is how I think Greece in particular has become a kind of, as others have said many times before, at least in parts, an open air prison for migrants and refugees. And so when we discuss this issue, and especially recently, most recently, when we publicly present Greek violations, we always find it very important to also mention the injustice and the very abusive and objectionable underlying premises that have created this to begin with, and that it is not simply a matter of bad Greek people that are doing very awful things, but it is also a structural matter in terms of the way that the European Union is constructed that has led to this outcome, and that it therefore cannot be simply a matter of criminal or criminal-like responsibility of particular border guards in the Evros region or in the Aegean Sea. And that ties to the question, to some of the question that I think Chris was asking about negative public opinion. So of course, you know, it's hard, it's a very rough field out there in terms of negative public opinion. But I think that at least showing some cognizance of these structural matters that are in the background helps convey that what we're doing here is not really about disciplining rogue states. It's about generating the conditions for a structural transformation that will allow more mobility in a sustained way for many people. And as Charles has recently commented, will also allow many people to stay where they are if it really succeeds, because they won't have to move anymore. And so this is my take on public opinion, and this, we have a lot to do here. You know, we have not yet been able to communicate that message, I think, in an effective enough way, but we are really interested in help in that. And this is where your question about dissertations comes into play, because as we have been doing this for both of us for more than a decade, we have started off, you know, kind of before our own doctoral work, I think for myself, and I think for Charles as well, And we have seen ourselves finish our doctoral work and become, publishing a little bit and working as activists in various contexts. And we have seen other people kind of join the club and writing dissertations right now that became very, very useful and informative for our work, and that became partners and people who have led projects. And so I don't think that your characterization is correct, that these are simply things that are necessarily left on a library shelf or in a file and not used afterwards. I think my own legal work is really relying now on a number of really talented PhD students. I would name here one, Noemi Magugliani, who has really started to lead alongside her academic work, and recently Niamh Kidi-Tabal, both of which are in the Irish Centre for Human Rights, which is where GLAN houses some of its activities, but there's no reason not to expand further. And I don't share this kind of bleak view of the academic work as irrelevant. Now, with regard to other media outlets, absolutely. I think Charles is really well placed to answer this more than myself, but for myself too, we are constantly trying to involve law and litigation alongside investigative journalism and investigative work, and more expressive forms of visual representation, as well as theoretical work. All of these things come hand in glove for us. And we have, both of us have various different registers of activity in these different categories. And as I said, Charles even perhaps more than me. In terms of military manuals of flag states, I must admit that the manuals that I've looked at mostly belong to Frontex. Frontex is, as you know, the European Border Enforcement Agency. And here I think you identify another possible kind of horizon for our work. If there is, I know, Itai, that you have expertise in this yourself, and if there is, if there are military manuals that can be helpful for us in establishing customary international law on various issues, for example, we would be very, very interested. Not always, but we have access to these sources. But in terms of Frontex, it has been a close study of their internal practices and the way that they try to streamline in human rights and make them a part of a kind of lingua franca for themselves, and reduce their critical edge that we have constantly tried to rekindle.
Maybe I can add just a few things very, very briefly, because I want us to continue the conversation. Statistics, Janina, I put a link in the chat. I'll just leave it at that. If you want to discuss statistics further, we can do so bilaterally if you like, but this list starts in 1993. And statistics were really collected by civil society organizations, networks, until more recently the IOM moved in to that activity as well. Dublin, I do not see any improvement at present. I think fundamentally the EU states cannot agree on a fair mechanism to redistribute migrants within Europe that also acknowledges migrants' desires and freedoms. And it's because of that absolute incapacity to find a common agreement that finally the only thing that EU states really can agree on is externalizing border control, right? The idea is really, because we're unable to manage those frail bodies once they set foot on European soil, we have to keep them from arriving at all and any cost. Chris, Itamar answered your question. I just want to stress as well the idea of practice-based research, right? We do not need to remain locked up in our ivory towers, right? I think it's really up to those researchers to go out there, contact NGOs, activists, GLAN, that might be, for whom their research might be useful. And, you know, I think it will give them an incredible advantage and access to empirical and urgent material that will really infuse their thesis. So I can really not encourage enough PhD students to really try to combine their thesis with collaborations with a range of actors out there. I think it will make their work more rewarding, more useful, and yeah, I think, you know, really everybody will benefit from that. Yes, we certainly do seek to engage with different platforms, from art context to video op-eds in the New York Times. So this is actually something we really invest quite a bit of work and energy in. And I guess this is really out of the idea that litigation is not won or lost within the restricted boundaries of the courtroom, right? The public space is really a fundamental arena, and the different spaces within that as well. And maybe just, I shared an article as well in the chat box from James Dennison and Andrew Geddes, which has been a really important article for me, because it really nuances the ideas that even some migrants' rights activists have, that, oh, you know, we're fighting a public opinion that is against us. Well, Dennison and Geddes really introduce a much more nuanced view. No, not all EU publics are against migrants. It's a lot more variegated in space and time, and that variation introduces room for potential change, I would say. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful, thanks so much. We've got 4 questions still on the board, and I do want to give us a break. So I say let's take these 4 questions. I will throw in a brief one of my own, and then once you've finished with these questions, we'll move on from there. Does that sound good? Great. Okay, the 4 questions we have: Alessandro, Reg, Elena, and Elisa, and then I will tack on a brief one.
Thank you for the presentation. For Itamar, can you please describe a little bit more or elaborate the notion of jurisdiction you're relying on, especially in light of the various human rights treaties you're working on for your cases? Then for Charles, I have a question for you in the way you conduct investigations. I know that, for instance, in Italy now has deployed a mission since 2016 in Libya, and especially with the vessel Capri, who's apparently coordinating the Libyan Coast Guard in the pullback operation. I have a question. Are you able to trace also communications between military vessels in this sort of operation? And with this, I stop.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, moving on. Elena.
Morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. I have a quick question. Are you going to speak about the Libyan case that is now pending before the European Court of Auditors? Because in case you are planning on saying something, I was wondering if you can maybe explain if it's applicable, or you're thinking about doing the same kind of case on the Turkey-Greece border and European funding and all the thing. And also, I have a non-professional, non-technical question to maybe both of you, but also all the people participating in the workshop. How do you manage, if you manage, not to get overwhelmed sometimes by working on this? I mean, because when you were, I was looking at the presentation when Charles, you were talking about these satellite images in which you see the military ships, like there are 38 military ships. I don't know the distance there, but it's super close to where a boat was left to die. And my thought, the first thought that I had in my mind was like, how do you not get disgusted with human beings? I mean, because those 38 ships have people there. And how do you, and sometimes, so sometimes it happened to me, like not to be able to cope with it anymore. It's like, how can you do that? And so it's just a very human, non-technical question that I just leave there. And thanks.
And a very important one, and part of the work. Elisa.
Yes, thank you. I also want to thank you for your talk. It's extremely interesting and also a little bit outraging, obviously. So I would have two questions which might go a bit outside of the scope of your presentation. So in case you don't have time, we can also discuss later. The first one is, I understand you were speaking about a specific case with military warships. I've heard as well that now you also have like a commercial ship which are not assisting rescuing refugees, and sometimes they also have links with states, for instance, when they're transporting oil or gas, and that they also relate to state-owned companies. And I was wondering if there's any work which is undertaken on this level. And my second question is also, we're talking about like a very European perspective and like European responsibility, but is there any way of also engaging states from the Global South in this campaign or litigation, or even trying maybe actions at the Global South? I don't really know how and which shape it could take, but I also think that some states might be either having responsibility or at least empathy with what is happening to the citizens, and thinking also of the ways of also making it like a really cross-border issues and not just a European topic for us. So those would be my questions. Thank you very much.
Great questions. Your first question pretty much anticipated my own. I'll just put it out there for a slightly separate flavor, but it's very much the same question. Whether you could speak to the interaction of shipping lanes and commercial shipping boats with the movements that you've observed, especially among the military boats, and how the interaction of shipping lanes works with the creation of spaces in the Mediterranean. Okay, back to you guys. You're muted, Itamar.
So
pointing to Charles.
I'll start then, in responding very briefly. Everybody, and I'm speaking as well to Itamar, I think that some of the questions are kind of anticipating issues that we'd like to discuss in the second part, right? In which we'll discuss a bit more EU, Italy, Libya policy of refoulement by proxy, and as well, in fact, our subsequent work connecting to the privatized pushbacks of migrants via merchant ships. So Alessandro's question on the Libyan Coast Guard and Italian operations, I think we can, let's hold on to that and address it in more detail later. Reg, thanks a lot for your questions. I am, of course, aware of human rights at sea, and I have heard, let's say, about the declaration, but I'm not, really directly involved. I'd be happy to know more about it. Then your question of, has there been, let's say, continuity or discontinuity between the era of colonial empires and the forms of more informal empire that we observe at present? I think it's a very important question. I think there is a lot of continuity in the sense of, for example, simply which are the bodies, the citizens, the bodies who are prevented from accessing EU territory at present, right? Those are predominantly citizens from former colonies, right? And the racialized discourse that surrounds them very much resonates with colonial discourses as well. At the same time, I think it's really quite essential, both methodologically and politically, to really keep a kind of tension between analyzing forms of continuity, but also looking at discontinuities, instabilities, Otherwise, we have a sense that empire is somehow monolithic and unchanging. And in a sense, it makes you feel that resistance is almost futile, right? One might really argue that the very forms and modality of empire have changed because of collective anti-colonial resistance to them, right? This is maybe something that we'll come back to as well in thinking about the politics of the law. Elena, how do we not get overwhelmed? How do we not lose trust in the human? Well, let me say simply that at times we do feel overwhelmed. At times we do lose faith. I mean, I'll give you an example. Recently, the Easter weekend, during which at the moment where states had gone in lockdown mode internally and externally, there were again increasing crossings, and Italy, Malta, and then even Libya declared their ports unsafe. I mean, we've been arguing that Libya is an unsafe port for years, but Libya actually announced it was non-safe in light of the coronavirus, right? And you had for several days several boats at sea with no assistance, etc., etc. And this is simply at times horrendous. But at the same time, I think our work is just a small contribution to a much wider movement with activists, rescue NGOs, the alarm phone, publics that are supportive of defending migrants' rights, and somehow being part of that broader ecology of actors who are fighting for freedom, justice, equality, solidarity. Somehow, at least for me, is certainly what keeps me going. Elisa, your question, I want just to pick up on the question of the responsibility of states and institutions of the global South. I think I'd rather keep the question of merchant ships maybe a bit more for the second part. But let me just mention, I think it's a very important question, and let me mention the initiative of ASGI, an Italian network of lawyers, which is also with which we closely collaborate, which is doing remarkable work and which is really trying to develop the collaborations between European and lawyers of the global South, but also the possibilities of recourse to the various courts in countries of the global South, in particular Africa. So this is really an ongoing discussion and initiative at present.
Yes. Do you guys hear me?
Yes, we do. So you're somehow on this twice. Your image says you're muted, but we hear you.
Yeah. I'm on this twice now because I had a hard time unmuting myself before, and my program kind of did not respond so much. So I came on another image of myself. But I also have some thoughts and answers. But I'm wondering whether at this point it would be actually better to you tell me, Jeff. I mean, I can respond quickly to some of the questions, or we can go out on a break and then we can pick it up maybe in the conversation later, whatever you say.
I have lost your image too. So why don't we take this as a sign to break now, come back, and let me just ask the students to hold us to it. So if any of these questions are getting neglected a bit, if you'd like to hear a bit more from Itamar on this, we don't circle back to it in the next part, remind us. Yeah, does that sound good? And we'll all take a break. What shall we do? Actually, let me ask Taylor now. Taylor, do you want us all, are you going to bounce us all and give us 5-10 minutes, or would you rather we just turn off our cameras and step away for a couple of minutes?
I think everyone can just turn off cameras and mute.
Okay,
yeah.
So let's 5-minute break. Is that good? Is that enough? Do you need more? 5 is good. Needs
5 minutes? Okay, yeah.
There's a 5, but not quite 10.
Apologize for the little technical glitch that I had in the end. I couldn't unmute myself or really participate. But I think that what we plan to do in this second part is have a kind of more dynamic conversation between us. on issues that we might have possibly different thoughts on or ongoing conversations about. But before that, I'd like to quickly address some of the questions that are left over from the first session that we had, because I think they're really important questions, and particularly the notion of jurisdiction, which is Alessandro's question, and which we plan to be, a main part of this session right now. But just quickly, I put in the chat box a relatively new article by Violeta Moreno-Lax, who is a colleague of ours, working very closely with both of us. She has, I think, led the thinking on kind of expanding the notion of jurisdiction, and I refer you to that article, which really solidifies and articulates the notion of jurisdiction that we have indeed relied on now in a number of cases, including SS versus Italy at the European Court of Human Rights, as well as SDG versus Italy at the United Nations Committee on Human Rights. We'll say more about that very soon. In terms of other issues that I really want to touch on, with regard to Reg's question, I enjoyed it very much, but I do think that Charles kind of addressed it sufficiently, and I don't have anything to add in particular. With regard to Elena's question on the Libyan Court of Auditors case, we're not planning to speak about that today because it's not a common project of ours, but I'm happy to answer questions about that via email. So write to me if you like. How do you manage to not to be overwhelmed? So I want to just briefly take a little bit of a different position, I think, than Charles took on this, which is to say that to me, this always kind of harks back to the classical political theory intervention by Hannah Arendt on the Eichmann trial, and the way that we are always also ourselves, in our lifetimes, participating in horrendous activities, even without knowing, or at least we're in the risk of doing so, even without realizing that. And so I think that alongside the quote unquote disgust with humans that are participating in horrendous activities, I also constantly try to put myself in their shoes and understand the constraints that they're working from, and understand, whether different circumstances in my own life could have also led me to positions and activities such as their own. This is also informed, admittedly, I will say biographically, by my own experience in my home country of Israel, where I served in the military. I was involved in certain activities that I now think are very wrong. And I think it's important to kind of take some position of a little bit of humility on these issues. And not always the moral high ground necessarily, even though that's also part of our vocabulary, obviously. Alyssa asked a very important question about courts and actors in the Global South. I just want to flag to you all a very important decision by the Papua New Guinea court that basically ended the Australian detention scheme there and the offshore processing there. It's a really poignant document to read, in my view. It quotes and alludes to and kind of refers to Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi in a way, and Mahatma Gandhi in the way that it describes the basic duties of human rights. And it is an example where a court in the Global South had a very important role. I also want to put a note of caution there and mention in this context a back and forth that I had with Thomas Gammeltoft Hansen and Nicholas Tan, who recently also wrote an article called A Topographical Approach to Jurisdiction, or maybe it's the topographical approach to human rights litigation in the context of migration, one of those two titles, but I'll put it in the chat very soon. They have really argued for much more engagement with courts in the Global South. And I think this should be taken with a grain of salt as well, because this is a constant move of governments that are trying to kind of shrug off their own obligations and say that, okay, Mauritanian court or a Libyan court or whatever should be responding to certain violations that are occurring in Libyan territory. This is, of course, outrageous when European governments are carrying out funding and initiating the practices behind a veil that jurisdiction creates. And so the call to engage with the Global South can easily become a very, very regressive move, in my view. In terms of shipping lines and commercial boats, I think I need to think about that a little bit more, and I want to kind of jump into some other issues, but maybe we can pick that conversation up as well later on with your permission, Jeff. Okay. What we have planned for now is a kind of conversation between ourselves that we wish to share with you, and hope that you can kind of find interest in and forgive our kind of self-indulgence in doing so. But really, I think it's a good format for thinking on our feet rather than just presenting material to you in a more kind of unidirectional way. And there are a number of things that I always want to talk with Charles about and ask him about. I want to start off by discussing a particular case, the T.M.C case of 2012, which I believe that many, if not all of you, are familiar with, which I think...
Can I break in procedurally before you get into the substance? Is this a good moment to experiment with a wide open conversation? It's the idea to invite everyone into your dialogue on an ongoing basis?
Yes, we can do that, but what we thought about, and what our proposed format is that we speak now more or less between ourselves for about 14 minutes or so.
Okay.
And then we open it up to everyone for a kind of open conversation.
Great.
If there's anyone who feels that they want to intervene apropos a particular, topic that we're talking about or something like that, you should also feel invited. I don't want to close off that kind of more direct response. Is that okay? All right. So going back to the jurisdictional question, the T.M.C case in 2012, of course, was T.M.C, JAMA, and others versus Italy at the European Court of Human Rights. It was a very, very celebrated case in which the European Court of Human Rights found a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights by Italy after Italy quote unquote, rescued asylum seekers, migrants in the Mediterranean high seas. And after the rescue, it had removed them and disembarked them in Libyan territory. The court found that they are in risk of inhuman and degrading treatment or torture, contrary to Article 3. And it was also a collective expulsion under Article 4 of Protocol 4 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And there was a very important reading of jurisdiction at that time. Jurisdiction could also obtain extraterritorially on the high seas with the condition that a migrant or a person, I should say, is under the control of a European authority, under the effective control of the European authority. And it could be either de facto control or de jure control. Either would, in fact, suffice to trigger that jurisdiction. This was a really, I think, celebrated moment for the human rights community that was working at the time on these issues. I just wanted to ask you, Charles, how did you respond to this judgment initially when it came to the fore? Where did it catch you in your own practice? And did it have any influence later on in terms of how you think about your work?
Thanks, Itamar. So, in fact, when the T.M.C judgment came out in 2012, you asked me, what did I make of it at the time? And I have to say, not very much. Very simply because we were struggling, I think, at the time with quite different issues in a sense, right? The major pattern of violence that we were observing and struggling against at the maritime frontier were practices of non-assistance, right? Now, so the question of pushbacks, of refoulement, whether enacted by European actors or non-European actors, was kind of secondary at the time for a simple reason in a way. The very actors that could operate refoulement by proxy had disintegrated, right? There was no Libyan state to speak of at the time. And the issue was not so much for us that, say, Italy was intercepting and bringing back migrants to Libya, but rather that EU states were disengaging from rescue altogether, right? That said, I do think that the combined reality of the disintegration of the Libyan Coast Guard, military, etc., and the Hirsi judgment was in fact a major element in, let's say, a phase of turbulence at the maritime frontier and rapid shifts, turbulence in the sense of instability, right? The European border regime was destabilized by the fall of these regimes that served as the pillar of the externalized border control. So you have a rapid change in policies. Initially, as we mentioned with the Left the Diebold case, you have a kind of retraction by state actors from their obligation to rescue. But as we see with Mare Nostrum, this simply was untenable, right? These deaths closer and closer to European shores were causing a public outrage that states felt, and state actors, I've interviewed, some of the military actors at the forefront of Mare Nostrum, state actors felt obliged to respond to, right? But that expansion of responsibility at sea, which Mare Nostrum was not tenable as well. So we have a kind of retraction again towards a policy of non-assistance, right? The ending of Mare Nostrum. But that again led to a staggering increase in migrants' deaths at sea, and led to a new shift, which would soon lead to a new phase in the policies of externalized border control, which we've worked on together, towards refoulement by proxy. So in a sense, I was not so attentive initially to the Hirsi judgment, even though I think it played a major role in that moment of instability. And we would really pay much closer attention to it later. But I think you, Itamar, and maybe a few other lawyers, but you prominently among them, were very attentive to the Hirsi judgment when it actually came out, and seeing quite clearly, I think, what the repercussions of that judgment might be. And there, I think, is something, again, that brings me back to what I see as a critical legal practice. A critical legal practice, I think, what would distinguish it from an idealistic legal practice is that it's always assessing the material effects of that practice, which are not always congruent with our ideal objectives. Right?
Yes. So what I hear you say is a couple of things. First, I think that interestingly, you are much more attentive to the realities on the ground. And I think that as lawyers, we tend to be distracted by the courts in some ways. And in this moment of celebration, Hirsi was no longer capturing the major human rights concern that you were in touch with. And I think that's already a kind of illuminating fact that we as lawyers, I think most of us in this room should take note of. And I'm also hearing you thinking about Hirsi in a very particular context of the post-revolutionary or civil war moment in North Africa. That is to say, you know, if I'm going to put this cynically, the court made a celebrated finding on a model that was already collapsed. So the critical potential of this finding was basically very, very questionable at the time, because this cooperation that the court reviewed in a critical way was no longer there. Those are the basic insights that I hear you describing here. And when you talk about the critical lawyering as a kind of attention to material results and a consequentialism rather than a kind of idealistic form of analysis that is looking at pristine principles devoid of their context, I think you're right that at that time, my position, and as you say, along with a number of other people, including I think notably Moritz Baumgartel, who has since published a book that has also addressed this issue. We thought of this as a judgment that would create a blueprint for continued human rights violations, because when the court specifies that jurisdiction has to do with control, and a control is understood in a corporal way of direct contact, then it also provides a recipe for circumventing and making a much more sophisticated and informed and reliable externalization kind of infrastructure. And I think what you're saying here, and this is exactly what I think happened, is that after the moment of instability, and in fact, the moment of instability has not really ended entirely at any point in time, but this instability followed with a much more entrenched externalization in infrastructure that cannot really be, that really raises problems of jurisdiction that triggers someone like Alessandro to ask, what is the notion of jurisdiction that you're relying on? And here really the push was to say, okay, we need a notion of jurisdiction that is encompassing both control through contact, through direct contact with bodies, but also a kind of contactless control that is done either from above or through financial measures or through the contribution of infrastructures such as boats and other forms of aid that is logistical. And this logistical environment that you have so expertly unearthed in your work has created the conditions in which I think such a notion of jurisdiction can be argued in a more convincing way.
Maybe I can come in here, Itamar, on trying to unpack a little bit precisely, operationally, what's that shift from direct refoulement to refoulement by proxy, what it actually looked like and how we tried to reconstruct it. Does that sound good?
Perfect.
So let me just share with everybody my screen for a few minutes, and I'm keeping it wide like this, rather, you know, you're seeing my, just so that it's easier for me to go between slides in a flexible way. And, you know, I just want to actually start by this image. Itamar, I'm sure you know it. I'm sure many others of you know it. This is a photograph taken by a Paris Match journalist who was on board one of the Italian Guardia di Finanza ships that was bringing back intercepted migrants to Libya back in 2009. So the very situations that the TRC judgment targeted. And I mean, in fact, this photograph is actually horrendously striking precisely for the contact with bodies that it is really very, direly illustrating, right? These are Italian and Libyan guards forcing a black man off from an Italian vessel in the port of Tripoli. So the shift, I think, that we see, again, to the practice of refoulement by proxy is again, has two grounds. One is the hearsay judgment, but the other is that, well, this is what the Libyan Coast Guard patrol vessels that had been donated by Italy, this is what they looked like in the wake of the 2011 NATO-led intervention, right? I mean, there was no longer any Libyan Coast Guard to speak of, right? Either institutionally or materially in terms of equipment. And I think what really, really happens basically is that after this moment of rapid fluctuation, and I do find that there is in fact a difference. I think that the border regime remains unstable, but somehow the aim and the logic of the border regime has somehow stabilized since 2016. And that logic is really border externalization no matter what, right? And so post 2015, with what we call the summer of migration, which is somehow the peak of migrants' capacity to overcome the borders of Europe, there's really a massive push towards border externalization, initially in Turkey, and then across the central Mediterranean. And which actor is Italy and the EU going to resort to? There's no Erdogan regime that they can, subcontract border control to, right? We're talking about a failed state with an inexisting, once again, Coast Guard agency. So really, as of mid-2016, the EU really embarks on a mission to reestablish a functioning Libyan Coast Guard agency to which it will be able to subcontract border control. And this is really an EU project in which Italy plays the leading operational role, right? If you will, Italy is the implementing partner of an EU policy, which you see with training of the Libyan Coast Guard on board EU NAVFOR-Med ships, which you see in agreements between Italy and the GNA, the Memorandum of Understanding in February 2017, which you see with Italy handing over refurbished or new vessels to Libya, with Marco Minniti, Minister of Interior at the time, delivering those vessels in May 2017, which you see with Italy launching, as Alessandro, I believe, mentioned, an Italian military intervention within Libyan territorial waters and within Libyan ports, which will contribute to surveillance and really serve as a temporary communication infrastructure, communication and coordination infrastructure for, again, a decimated Libyan Coast Guard, which you see with EU and Italian support to Libya's declaration of its SAR zone, right? You really have to understand that for EU and Italy to frame Libyan Coast Guard interceptions as legitimate rescue activities, well, the Libyan Coast Guard had to have all the attributes of a legitimate Coast Guard agency, including a SAR zone. And so this is really, these are the operational and political components of this policy of refoulement by proxy, which really aims to have migrants intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard under a range of policy and operational components that are really in control of EU and Italy, but in which EU and Italian actors never physically touch the bodies of migrants, right? And I think there's quite a striking and extraordinary contrast between the image with which I began this brief discussion, right? The physical touching of bodies on board an Italian ship, and this last image, which here you see, in fact, an Italian warship remaining at a distance and never physically touching the bodies of the passengers who are here intercepted by a Libyan Coast Guard vessel. So,
yeah.
No, I just wanted to say two things and then precisely ask a question to you, Itamar.
I have a comment before.
Oh, no, go. If you prefer. What I wanted to stress here is that our reconstruction of this policy did not pre-exist our dialogue with Itamar, Violetta, and ASCI lawyers and legal experts. Rather, it is really a reconstruction of a policy that emerges from a dialectical process, a back and forth between factual policy reconstruction and legal argument, in which we see a new practice emerge, and we wanted to contest that practice, and we bring this practice to our brilliant lawyer friends, and Itamar, Violetta, ASCI lawyers tell us, okay, Charles, if you want to reconstruct this and you want us to establish jurisdiction, this is what you need to go looking for, right? And this sharpens our own empirical analysis. So I really want to stress this really essential process of back and forth between the empirical analysis and the legal argument, and the way they both mutually constitute each other. And then maybe I think that the trajectory, Tamar, that we've just traced together, that you foresaw, but that actually unfolded, really begs the questions to what extent litigation not only contests violence and violation, but also becomes somehow, well, I'm taking this image from that I'm sure you know, Itamar, becomes the architect of new and transformed forms of violence. So this is an image from an Israeli courtroom on the trajectory of the wall of separation, and the question emerged for A.L. Weitzman, Michael Spard, and other lawyers, to what extent, in contesting the trajectory of that wall and seeking to make it less inhumane, were they literally becoming the architects of the wall? We can ask the same question, I think, in relation to the maritime frontier. To what extent, in contesting it and its modalities, are we becoming its architects?
Okay, a few brief comments on what you just said. Firstly, I think that it would be good to take note of the Articles of State Responsibility, the draft Articles of State Responsibility, and the way in which they generate a reality whereby a state can be responsible for a violation of international law that happens in another state when it's in control of that violation, whether it's promulgated by a non-state actor or indeed simply by another state. And I think that part of the dialogue that you just talked about among us was in this kind of gap between the regime created by the draft Articles of State Responsibility, where it's relatively more easy to say, I think, that a state has violated public international law by contributing directly and effectuating a certain abusive policy abroad, and the rather still more limited scope of jurisdiction under hearsay, at least in the orthodox or standard interpretations of the case. And I think that I can share here that we weren't always in agreement among our team on how far we should push in terms of progressive interpretation of the law. So as you may know, one mode of legal thinking is really, I think, derived from purposive interpretation, generally speaking, Dworkinian legal thought, will lead one to think that the law can be moved progressively forward through reinterpretation of existing doctrine that constantly kind of expands the scope of justice. And so that's one mode of thinking that has been employed in these projects, for sure, by us. But the other kind of constant suspicion, at least in my mind, was that really by this very progressive interpretation, we end up further solidifying the violative and the abusive practices that we want to criticize. And this is where you surprise me here, but this is where the reference to the fence, the wall here in Palestine, Israel is really informative. And if you already brought it up, I will allow myself to provide another illustration from this context, which is this image that Michael Spald uses of the wall and the gate. So this is very kind of specific about this architecture that you're describing. And I put in brackets that, it's not by chance that we're talking about walls in both contexts, even though the contexts are very different. But he says, okay, we challenged in the Israeli High Court of Justice the location of the separation barrier that was not on the edge of the occupied territories, but crosses private property of Palestinian farmers. And these Palestinian farmers want to do away with this wall altogether. But then the court offers us, why don't we just put a gate in that wall that will be open during working hours? And the Palestinian farmers can easily cross during working hours under military supervision and reach their farm lands that are on the other side. And then he says, okay, so I discussed this with my clients and they say, hey, this is a wonderful idea. Why don't we do that? And we'll have a practical remedy. But this practical remedy ends up extinguishing the fight for liberation that motivated the litigation to begin with, that really wanted to assert the illegality of this very structure. So I think in a very, very similar way, and your example here is illuminating, this kind of litigation, and here is still the most progressive precedent that we have, ends up solidifying and providing a recipe for results that in reality are either more harsh or just as harsh in terms of the affected population. So this is just to kind of even more strongly assert those same points. Now, you had, I think, a follow-up or perhaps a different question.
Well, Itamar, I'm kind of weary of time. So actually, I think this is a really interesting and important thread here. And maybe we can just continue a bit on that thread.
Jeff, should we open it up now kind of officially, or what do you think in terms of the way that you are?
Sure, why don't we start opening up and see, we'll let it build. So, okay. So one hand is already up there, it's Alessandro's. And I will also tack on in my typical fashion that the dialogue where it has just ended is incredibly resonant with several different talks that we've had. I'll use Gavin Sullivan's as an example. So Gavin, as all the participants know, is representing persons blacklisted before the Security Council. I recently attended a webinar with the past and present ombudspersons. And it was just stunning how an absolutely atrocious system, which is a violation of every principle of decency under law, was being celebrated by virtue of the humanity of the ombudsperson. So a deeply structurally flawed problem which holds people indefinitely on the basis of weak intelligence that is never shared, secretly gathered and transmitted from office to office in ways that are designed to circumvent protections rather than for any more principled reason, is perpetuated on the basis of having a good human being in the ombudsperson's office. Yeah. And then the problems that raises are not different from the problems raised for the defense. The person you can't call them a defense lawyer. This isn't a properly court of law, but the person who's conducting the defense. So Gavin gets 5 people off of the list. That is great. And then that's used to say, look, the system's working. They came off, right? And the system is perpetuated. And the people who have been there 15 years, there are others who will be there for another 15 more. People will get added every day. And he is complicit in the reproduction of a absolutely Orwellian, Kafkaesque, add your famous writer adjective on top of it, system. And it's not particular to Gavin's work. And it's part of, in the nature of the somewhat broader themes of the last couple of days, part of the work that we all are doing or are thinking about doing. So it's a really, really powerful discussion that goes to a number of the choices that we have to make in the course of our practices. Now, I do see a hand from Alessandro, and now, so this is now transitioning into an open conversation.
Can I just add one very brief point before really opening up, but just because it's connecting to what Itamar was saying. So Itamar, of course, this is under, you follow, needless to say, much more closely, literally, these questions in Palestine, Israel than I do, but my reading of this is influenced by A.L. Weitzman's book, The Lesser Evil, right? Which I, by the way, think is really quite extraordinary. And if my recollection is correct, Sfar discusses how at the time when he was fighting in Israeli courts, the trajectory of the wall, within an international court, he was contesting its very existence, right? If my memory is correct, Itamar, again. But let's consider it's correct. You might, what I think is really interesting here for me is how we keep in tension those immediate demands for, countering specific forms of violence or making practices more humane, but in a way that does not necessarily challenge the systemic nature of that violence. And at the same time, we seek to challenge that systemic nature, right? And I think there's something, for example, really, really interesting in, for example, Rosa Luxemburg's thinking on revolutionary realpolitik, right? How a horizon of profound change shapes our practices around immediate and urgent issues in the present. Or a colleague of ours, Sandro Mezzadra, speaks of the idea of split temporality, how we're both located at the same time, we're split in the urgencies of the present, which demand our response, and a broader and longer term horizon of change. And how do we keep that in tension? And certainly there's no easy way to resolve, I think, those tensions. But I think for me, this is quite essential.
Great. Alessandro.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot for the explanation. I had the possibility to have a quick grasp to the article as well. My question is, aren't you worried that the paradigm of jurisdiction you're relying on is deciding a little bit too much to the notion of overall control, which actually opens a total different scenario, which is state responsibility for actions of privates of another state, for instance, or private or not agents of the state, for which actually the ICJ as well said this responsibility is not there unless there is an effective control. First question. So you also spoke about ERC as a fundamental case. I have to say, I thought quite a bit about the questions and Italy involvement in the Mediterranean, and I thought mostly the way I would solve the issue, and I also look closely about the amicus curiae in SNS, probably Alskeini is probably a better guide for that in terms of doesn't require an effective control over the persons. And in this regard, I go back to the issues that the involvement of the Italian Coast Guard in coordinating from Libya the rescue mission is probably an indicator of such public exercise of public function abroad, so justifying the extraterritorial control, extraterritorial jurisdiction. So my worry is that with SNS, if you go towards, and I don't want to sound critical and just try to establish a dialogue on that. My worry is that if you open to such notion of jurisdiction, this opening actually could actually have a backlash, because states may be worried that every actions, like for instance, UK providing weapons to Saudi Arabia and giving some coordination to coordinating activity to Saudi Arabia on how to use this weapon in Yemen, this will be considered also a violation of Article 2 or Article 3, opening for the jurisdiction of the European Court. So this is just 2-3 scenarios I'm coming with, like, and with this, I conclude. Sorry if I wrote.
Great. Thank you, Alessandro. I propose, instead of our usual format, which is to take a few questions at once and turn a sort of question and answer period, let's do this more as a dialogue. Nerges, I know, does not have a blue hand up, but has a question. Lulu as well. But why don't we start, Itamar and Charles, with response to Alessandro. Nerges and Lulu, please jump in as you feel comfortable. If it's going a while and you haven't really found the space for it, then I will intervene to get you back in. How's that?
Alessandro, if I understand you correctly, your worry is what happens in the event that SNS is decided for us. Is that correct?
No, no, it's not that. I actually hope that you're going to win this case, and I have no criticism of that. It's more on the notion of jurisdiction you rely, that is so expansive to a certain extent that can scare the court as well, to the extent that it can be used like exponentially to a number of other situations. And this is only that, because also it brings also the question of control over third parties, and the European Court of Human Rights struggle with the attribution stuff as well.
So I'll answer this very quickly, and to say that I'm very concerned about what you described, and I think that it's a challenging case. I think that our interpretation, it won't be surprising to anyone that I think that our interpretation is correct, but I think it is a great challenge for the court to follow this interpretation. And in my view, my basic orientation on these matters is realist. I don't think that the court is insulated from public opinion, politics, economics, and culture. And so in this moment where, as you may know, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, even the most fundamental protections, the most direct forms of refoulement are being, constantly violated. And taking into account ND and NT versus Spain and what happened there, it will be very difficult for the court to follow this interpretation. I do hope, as you do, that it will, but it could create a kind of dance back. I think generally speaking, the European Court of Human Rights is going one step forward, 2 steps backward on these issues, and it's not clear that we have a unidirectional progressive interpretation to rely on. But I think on the other hand, that really, as you say, the ICJ has found state responsibility when there is effective control. And here, our interpretation doesn't demand going beyond effective control. It does try to bring the articles of state responsibility and the interpretation of the ICJ of state responsibility to a more common ground. And I think that the Libyan case in that regard is still quite unique in terms of the depth and the kind of all-encompassing nature of the Italian and European intervention there. in that regard, there are certain dissimilarities that can be stressed with regard to Turkey and with regard to Morocco in the Spanish case, which may also, reflect that this is indeed a very particular set of circumstances in which intervention is required and doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of slippery slope that you have described. Yeah, I'll keep it at that for now.
I don't have much to add here. I think we should continue with more questions to keep the conversation flowing.
Great. I know that Nerges has one, Lulu as well, and Itai is also showing. So jump in, any three.
Thank you for this great conversation. I'm very happy to have heard it so far. I have a question regarding the thought that you may become the architects of violence at the border. And I have the feeling that I wanted to ask whether you gradually have this realization and think that maybe you become more critical of litigating, or did you have those thoughts from the beginning? And if you have those thoughts right now, or those thoughts of becoming architects of violence, by even if you say that the most progressive judgment here provided all these possibilities for further violation, how do you then justify for yourself continuing to engage in litigation? What are the arguments that you have if you have the doubts of becoming the architects of violence? How are you continuously doing those interventions? With what arguments?
Maybe I can provide a very brief answer before giving it to you as well, Itamar. Thanks, Nerges, and good to see you. I think, and I think Itamar and myself, we share this. It is not because we are, we realize that there is a level of complicity, in a sense, that despite ourselves, that exists in our intervention, that we are planning to refrain from litigating. Right? But I think that being aware of the way our practices shape state responses in turn should help us sharpen our practices and think, maybe a few steps in advance, as in a chess game, right? And I think this actually, I think, is our responsibility, if you will. But I just wanted to offer, maybe another perspective into this question of complicity, which might be thought of through a Foucauldian lens. I don't know if Foucault, how prominent Foucault is in legal studies, right? But there's this, Foucault has often been criticized as someone who is somehow a pessimistic thinker, right? There's no outside, there's no way out to power relations, right? And that's not the way I feel, actually, about Foucault's work, right? Foucault, however, did not believe in ultimate liberation. For example, he did not really believe in achieving a classless society, if you will, right? Foucault rather believed that if you contest forms of power, you will transform them, maybe you will mitigate them, but power will not disappear, will not evaporate, right? And so that is somehow what we're left with. It's a hand-to-hand struggle, right? And that is maybe more modest, right? But I don't think it's less important.
Okay, that was actually pretty comprehensive, Charles. But what I want to add is that the directionality, Nerges, that you described is precisely the opposite from the directionality that I have experienced so far. I kind of, the article that I'm drawing from when I describe this kind of dynamic, the dangerous dynamics around Hirsi, is an article from 2013. And since then, I've been constantly pulled back to litigation by Charles and by others, and by my own kind of feeling that, very simply put, it's better to do something and try, and kind of strategically, as Charles describes, take into account all these critical insights, and not just simply leave the field open entirely. And here, the hope is not only to, as you already said, Charles, even in the first part, the hope is not only to succeed in courts. In fact, the processes are often so slow that it makes it very, very, as I described, very questionable how valuable the judgments are by the time they arrive, but also to work with social movements, to provide a certain framework for conversation with the wider public, to bring these things to consciousness, and all these things are very much part of the project. Finally, with regard to Foucault, just a kind of a brief association. Of course, Foucault is very influential in legal academia, but something that a text that I recommend to you that I've encountered, and I don't think that many people know, I know that Charles knows, is a text Foucault wrote titled Confronting a Government's Human Rights. And this is within the context of the Vietnamese refugee crisis, the boat people crisis, and the involvement of MSF that was founded around that time in this context. And it is surprisingly and almost bewilderingly kind of assertive and strong about this idea that there is a responsibility that belongs to everyone in confronting the governments that govern us all, and that we are part of a community of people that are governed by this particular form of power that is a government, or the power of governments. And I just thought that it would be it would be interesting for those of you who are in this field to take a look at that text as well.
I'm actually going to abuse my role and jump in here, though I know Lulu's had a question for a while and Itai's got one too. But having weighed in on it earlier, I did want to sharpen the point a bit. Charles has put this issue of complicity into the Foucauldian context. And that's a really wonderful thing to do, because now complicity becomes not merely something to be guilty about, but it becomes empowering. Mm-hmm. We are all already involved in the reproduction of power and the movement of power.
Absolutely.
Then the question is, in what ways and how do we know it? And here is where legal practice can be as much a distraction as an opportunity. When we're dealing with something like complicity, the first instinct is to sort of recoil. I don't want to be part of that, right? A very typical move from within progressive international legal circles and others is to resort to idealism and moralism, right? Mm-hmm. This is the way it should be. I'm gonna work for the law that says how it should be. I'm gonna condemn the people who don't do things the way they should, right? But that's more an abnegation of responsibility. That's more denying the power that we're already implicated in than it is working to change it, yeah? And this couldn't be the better presentation to make this clear, because of the different ways that law is being worked up with other methods to find the ways and the places in which power is moving. It's not specific to this presentation. I think back the clearest single example is still in Joseph Wild's PowerPoint, where he points out the bottlenecks, right? That wasn't properly legal analysis. And the ways to undo those bottlenecks may not be through this rule or that norm, right? But it is happening for a reason, also with legal researchers working out the ways in which authority, along with material, is moving and the people that are implicated. And this is really crucial to the lessons across the different topic areas. And there I'll make some space again. Lulu, you've been waiting a while.
Yes. I would like to go back to the issue of jurisdiction, which is obviously a very problematic issue, which challenges the accountability for states for what they've been doing. And in that context, I would like to hear your thoughts about the notion of shared responsibility, which exists in international law. And I was wondering, have you been exploring that notion? Because I think, especially in this case, there are a lot of states who are together, whether it's in the EU context or NATO, are cooperating, and that leads to them hiding behind their obligations. And I think shared responsibility is something that could be useful in this context, but I don't know. I'm interested in that.
Should I, yeah.
Or I mean, so now, I mean, Itai or Eleni, if your question either corresponds with this or echoes off of it, then now's a good time to just carry on with questions. But I'm not going to do it in a question round type way. Okay, but to you, Itamar and Charles.
Okay, so I'm thinking that you're probably alluding to the notion that I think most prominently Andre Noel Camper has been working on for, I think now many years in the Shares project. And we've been following that, and I think that it has been informative. But frankly speaking, I don't have, that project has informed my work, and I've been following it, and I have no doubts about its value, but I do think that more often in our work, the notion of shared responsibility is a technique of deflecting responsibility. It's not a technique of holding someone to account. More challenging than revealing the shared responsibility is pinpointing a particular actor, whether a state, an individual, or firm, that can actually, in fact, be held accountable, not as a matter of doctrine, but as a matter of law within a certain political context. And it's obvious that there is a way in which the projects that we're describing here are, the responsibility for them is shared. If we just focus on the Libya-Italy nexus, we constantly have the background problem of the responsibility of Frontex and other European member states. But rather than saying that this responsibility is shared, we want to go even, we want to go beyond that, and we want to try to find the ways in which we can say, aside from Italy, this particular state is responsible, whether it be a state that has a particular vessel in a particular moment at sea, or someone on board a Libyan ship, or what have you, in order to try to, rather than spread responsibility, solidify it in a particular node, a particular junction in a kind of network that's constantly moving and constantly being shared as a method of deflecting responsibility that is, by the way, very, very self-conscious. I think that it's clear that in the very legal architecture of Frontex, the sharing between European member states is something that is by design supposed to allow states to do things that otherwise it would be very, very difficult to do.
I just want to add something very, very brief to this, highlighting also the question of, I've talked about Italy as the implementing partner of an EU project, right? And so in this sense, I think that the recent work that GLAN has been doing on the funding of initiatives in Libya is incredibly important. So you can see this as kind of a step process, right? First, we go after the implementing partner, but we're well aware that this is an EU policy. And so, yes, it felt very, very, very important, the work that GLAN has continued to do to try to address EU responsibility. But there's maybe another twist in this question as well, which is a question that we've discussed a lot as well between us, which is, let's say, the responsibility and agency of Libyan actors, right? And this is a place where maybe empirical analysis and also political arguments partly conflicted with legal argument, in the sense that there is now a whole body of critical research on policies of externalization, which seeks to foreground also the agency of countries and states of the global south, right? Arguing that say Morocco, say Turkey, etc., are not the passive recipients of policies that EU states impose onto them, but are kind of mobilizing an unequal relation to their own interest, right? And so this seems something, an important argument and perspective to take on board to counter some, a degree of Eurocentrism, let's say, in NGOs focusing on, and researchers focusing on European policy. So this was a question that we had in mind. To what extent do we want to acknowledge the agency of Libyan actors, even within a failed state context, and even within a highly unequal relation with its EU partners, and to what extent the acknowledgement of that agency weakens the argument for effective control.
We are approaching the last 10 minutes, so why don't we get at least all of the hands that are still up out on the floor, and I still encourage everyone to join in as you see fit. So Itai, Eleni, and Nieta.
Thank you, Jeff. So if I may, a quick comment and a question. So I could almost resist not commenting on the calculus behind litigating the path of the separation wall in occupied Palestinian territory, but maybe just to share from the perspective of an agency that funds legal aid. One of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make was to terminate legal aid because we felt that the legal aid bordered on renouncement of rights. And I have to say, I've spent over a year following that decision, dealing with the fallout, both in terms of the beneficiaries' discontent with the fact that they were denied legal aid, and from the lawyers' frustration that they were no longer funded in that case related to protection from forcible transfers. So it always is a very complex calculus, and I think we made there's similar comments previous sessions on cause versus case lawyering. But that is just a comment. But my question to Itamar, as you were talking about the ASR, I jotted this and just wanted to see if I got this right. So I think when you look at the internal dimension of state responsibility, you've navigated, no pun intended, with I think legal certainty, but factual uncertainty as to the extent of let's say participation or services, or maybe I'm wrong. And then there's the external dimension, where I think there's far less legal certainty as to the obligation of states, but factually things might be more easy to package. So maybe just to get your sense of that.
Great. And I think that pun was intended. I don't believe you.
Yes, it was.
Eleni, Nieta, and Leonie also now.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I found the presentation fascinating and your work too. In 2018, when I read the New York Times piece you published, I found it absolutely mind blowing. It kept me up for days in a row, and I was like, this is a fantastic tool to have to use in cases and legal argumentation and litigation, to be able to kind of reconstruct the events in a way that wasn't previously possible. I just wanted to bring back a bit Reggie's question, and also kind of like tease out a bit more this idea about how the law is a tool for domination, and how our reactions can also sort of like disrupt these domination hierarchies that the law has created. And I was wondering, I understand absolutely the idea that you can't just leave everything to be that everything goes, and you need to keep bringing law into the conversation to say that this is not an open court for governments to do whatever they want. But I was wondering where you kind of like, how do you imagine, and where you stop sort of like playing the game when even like questions about who is entitled to the obligation of non-refoulement is animated by questions of or distinctions between refugees and other migrants, between who is subjected to persecution and what persecution means, and how like continued colonialities of the law and of European domination abroad actually means that like some people will be categorized as refugees and others as migrants. And if we're only talking about refugees, then we kind of like playing this game that is always based on European understandings of, you know, who is entitled to protection and who's not. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Nieta.
Thank you both for this. This was really eye-opening, actually. This is not a question. I just wanted to go back to something that Jeff mentioned before about power structures kind of focusing on how things should be as opposed to addressing how things currently are. Because what you said reminded me of a news item from a couple of years ago where a German captain rescued a lot of asylum seekers and brought them to a port in Italy. And then they criminalized her for doing that, and the UN actually condemned Italy's stance on that matter. And then when I was reading about it, I was also thinking, okay, yeah, you're condemning it, which is great, but what next? There's nothing. It seems kind of like a toothless thing to condemn this practice and then have nothing concrete to say, well, okay, there are no consequences for Italy's practices, you know? Thank you.
And Leonie.
Thank you. My question relates to jurisdiction authorization as well. But I understand that it's a bit controversial and maybe also political. So I apologize prior to my question.
I don't think you need to here.
So it is about the article of Violetta that you mentioned before as well. I'm gonna read out a quote of her. It's on page 402. It says, "Still others question the necessity of a legal basis in all cases for public powers to be ascertained. For example, in anti-terrorism and drone strike operations undertaken without the territorial state's authorization." My question is, what is your stance on this thought? Would this be an avenue that you would consider arguing that 40,000 deaths are so urgent and so imminent that we could take action without the authorization of Italy or Malta, for example? And this also connects to Nieta's question as well, that then no criminal charges would be pressed as well. Thank you.
Great. So we're down to our last 4 minutes, Itamar and Charles. Good luck.
Yeah, I will try to be very partial and very quick if possible. I'm not going to answer everything. I'm just going to thank you, Ty, for the comment, and I need to think about that a little bit more, and maybe I'll circle back to you on it. With regard to the question, when do you stop? Eleni asked this question. I think it is a really important question, and I think that in my own case, one place where I stop is where I think that the interpretation required is really beyond the scope of a reasonable interpretation that a court could adopt. And so there is a kind of autonomy to the legal field that I still think exists if we look at many jurisprudence over time, and we need to think about the horizons of possibility and not to delude ourselves to do things that are entirely off the wall arguments, as Stanley Fish calls them in one of his pieces. That's one place where I stop. And that's one place where I, try to at least take my partners in the Charles and others another step and say, okay, give me something better that I can work with. That sometimes happens. I think that the German case, or the case in Italy with regard to the German person that I believe it was Nieta described, is the case of Carola Rekete. Is that correct? Yeah. So I think that perhaps contrary to the trajectory that you described, in this case, finally, the Italian court found that she had not been responsible for a crime in her action, and in fact did kind of recognize her activity as legal. And so it is actually a good example of a certain win in the domestic context. So I encourage going back to, also I encourage myself to go back to that case and look again at what happened exactly. But I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. With regard to Leone, in Violetta's article, I'm not in the position to answer for Violetta, obviously, and we do have our certain disagreements about certain things, although I admire her work as a lawyer, and I think she is really one of the strongest lawyers in this field, around. But we do have certain disagreements. I'm not sure, I wasn't able to capture exactly what you are discussing with regard to that particular quote. I can think about two different aspects of what you're thinking about. One is whether civil disobedience or acts contrary to the law, the domestic law of a particular state are ever justified. Is that what you were trying to get at?
No, it was more a comparison between what she was saying was that when we have counter-terrorism measures, usually jurisdiction is not an excuse to take action on a state's territory without authorization. And I wanted to hear from you whether you think that this could also be applied in this situation we've been talking about, because I do believe that the crisis has reached a certain threshold of deaths. Yeah, but that's just my personal opinion.
Threshold of death that would allow for action to be taken without Italy's consent.
Yes.
I can't imagine that would happen, and I think that it would be very objectionable. And I kind of tend to, as a basic position, I would have to think about this further, but to kind of agree with the need to establish consent. And with regard to Libya, there have been actions that have been taken without consent under a UN Security Council decision. So I think that we could look to that example as a real life example of what you're describing, and whether that was effective or not. Surely also the question of its legality can be further developed. But I see that we have run out of time.
Yes, unfortunately.
And Charles, I apologize to you for taking up those 3 minutes.
Oh, but unless everybody has to rush off, I would love to add just two small words. Yeah. One, I just find that the question of when do you stop playing the game, right? I don't have a straightforward answer to that, and I think it really depends so much on context. But I think it's a really important question to always somehow have in mind. I also think that you can stop playing the legal game, but you can also think of all the other practices that are necessary. One, I'm sure you're all familiar with Samuel Moyn's book, Not Enough. And I keep reminding myself and others that, the book is titled Not Enough. It's not titled Useless, right? Meaning the law, legal politics, it's great at doing some things. And let's do that. Let's use the law for what it's good to be doing. but let's also really think of all the other practices that lie beyond, let's say, at least the usual scope of the law, and that we also need to be engaging with. And maybe one way of thinking through that is looking at how non-lawyers are using the law. So Itamar has wonderful passages in his book, Humanity at Sea, where he describes migrants as lawyers of sorts, right? He shows that migrants embody in their own strategy a degree of legal thinking, right? And the NGOs that several of you have been mentioning also, I think, have been practicing a quite extraordinary legal politics recently. Think again of Carola Rackete and her forcing of the Italian blockade at the time. And I've put an interview here in as a link. I've been thinking about this with some NGO rescue activists as a form of strategic transgression, right? That kind of takes us a bit beyond or out of the language of anti-impunity. And effectively, by transgressing the policy of closed ports in Italy, NGOs forced the Italian judiciary to intervene against Salvini-led policies. And those, I think, are incredibly interesting legal practices that are, again, a little bit diagonal or different to the maybe more conventional anti-impunity perspective with which many of us, and we must also work.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We are over time. It's been 3 hours and not enough time. This has been tremendous. Eye-opening has been said, provocative, exciting, in-depth. It's been wonderful. Thank you both so much. Yes, the big yellow hands are coming out. Okay. Thank you both.
All of you. This has been a great conversation, and it's been great to think together.
Yeah. Really, thank you for having us here. And as I said, you're welcome to write and be in touch. Thanks, Jeff, for organizing this.
Right. And thanks, everyone. This has been excellent. So it's a well-earned lunch break, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. Okay. Itamar, Charles, thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.